It is now my duty to introduce two people. I'm going to be introducing Katie Martin, who will share insights about Richard Holbrooke and this award, as well as her personal remarks about John Irving. And I'm also going to introduce Bob Shikoshes, who will introduce John Irving in his work. After I finished saying a few things about each of you, Katie and Bob, you can both at the same time come up to the stage like Jay-Z and Beyonce. Best-selling author and human rights advocate Katie Martin is a member of the DLPP Honorary Advisory Board. She has served as chair of the International Women's Health Coalition, chief advocate for the UN's Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, and board member of Human Rights Watch. She is currently a director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and board member of the International Rescue Committee, the New America Foundation, and Central European University. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, PEN International, and the Authors Guild. A contributor to major networks and news publications, Martin has also published 9 books, including Enemies of the People, My Family's Journey to America, a 2010 finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Prize, Paris, A Love Story, a New York Times bestseller, and True Believer, Stalin's Last American Spy. Among countless honors for writing and human rights advocacy, Martin has received the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary. She was also recognized by the United Nations and named a Rockefeller Foundation Creative Arts Fellow. Bob Shikoshes is the 2014 DLPP Fiction Award for The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, and a member of the DLPP Honorary Advisory Board. His first collection of stories, Easy in the Islands, won the National Book Award for First Fiction. And his second collection, The Next New World, was awarded the Prix de Rome from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is also the author of the novel Swimming in the Volcano, a finalist for the National Book Award, and The Immaculate Invasion, a work of literary reportage that was a finalist for the New Yorker Book Award for Best Nonfiction of the Year. His most recent novel, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and selected as the best book of the year by the Washington Post, NPR, and others. Bob is a contributing editor at Outside, a former columnist for Gentleman's Quarterly, and has served as a contributing editor for Harper's and GQ. Stylish man. His op-ed articles on the U.S. military, Haiti, and Florida politics have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, the very, very eloquent duo of Katie Martin and Bob Shikoshes.
Thank you, Will. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Will, your absolutely extraordinary performance this evening has only been slightly marred by the fact that you called me Katie. I'm a proud Hungarian named Kati, but we'll talk about that later. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, could only take place in America. And like David, I am completely overwhelmed and intimidated by the quality of the speakers and by the depth of the humanity. And Min, you have made me feel Korean, and Hala, you have made me feel Palestinian, and you have all made me feel very proud to be an American. And Min, I also thank you for giving me permission to be emotional, because Dayton is a place that's so full of emotion for me. But before I go on to speak about Richard Holbrooke and what he did here in Dayton, and I was privileged to be by his side. We were relatively newlyweds, and so he wanted me right there inside Wright-Patterson with him as he brought these Balkan warlords and war criminals to heel. Before I launch into that, I want to just acknowledge the remarkable thing that Sharon, you have done here in creating such a community. And there are so many other people that I've become friends with, thanks to you, and thank you for calling me back every year. It's become one of my favorite rituals in my life, and I cannot think of a more meaningful way to honor my husband's legacy than to name a literary peace prize after him, and of course this year to be able to present it to the singular talent that is John Irving is a particular thrill, and it would make Richard very, very proud. I have, as I was listening and deeply moved by all of the speakers, I have made an absolute mess of my remarks because I kept borrowing John's pen and crossing out stuff and writing stuff. So if I can make out what this is, it'll be a miracle, but let me try. It'll be a shorter miracle than the one I originally intended to say because I want to hear John, not me. John, of course, has expanded our vision and stretched it to embrace the quirkiest, most ferociously human and independent souls and made us love them as he does. Richard Holbrooke, too, was a humanist. His brand of diplomacy was one human at a time, and his ultimate target in bringing these warlords to the peace table was the human psyche. He studied them. His diplomacy was not an institutional abstract concept. It was paying very close attention to the man across the table and observing him, and even his many dramatic eruptions have been theatrically portrayed, and I can tell you that those so-called eruptions were carefully rehearsed because he rehearsed them with me. And when he would hit a wall with Milosevic or Tudjman or Izbegovic, he very often asked me to take them for a walk in that lovely parking lot outside Wright-Patterson, where I circled and circled and circled, and Richard's instruction to me was, make them focus about their future and the future of their children and their grandchildren. And let me tell you something, those guys were not interested in their grandchildren's future. They were interested in one thing: power and holding on to power. It was such an eye-opening experience for me to discover that, that people who make war should not be the people in charge of the peace. I think Richard and John, who unfortunately didn't know each other, but I think they would have really liked each other. John and I have known each other for a couple of decades, and I think that they both, I hope I'm right in this, John, I think they both feel that our country is built on a particular vision and not merely on power, that their America inspires and draws the dispossessed to our shores for a second chance. I hope it still does. I hope it still does. As I mentioned, Dayton is deep in my heart, and I partly because I shared the most dramatic weeks of my life here in that fall of 1995. But also because I observed Dayton, the town, play its role for history, because the town was very much, and Richard encouraged that, was very much involved in the entire process of making peace. And the reason Richard chose Dayton was because it was in the heartland, because it was middle America. He didn't want it to be in the, one of those glittering diplomatic settings that are usually chosen, Geneva or Vienna or Paris. He wanted this to be an American peace, with Americans surrounding that base. He wanted those guys behind the barbed wire, but he wanted the town to be involved. And the town was, and through this amazing literary Peace Prize, which has now turned into an amazing network and a project, it has continued to play that role. And this afternoon, as I always do when I return to Dayton, my good friend Matt Joseph, and this year I was accompanied by my beloved friend Kathy Lacey. We went to all the pilgrimage points. Now there's a Holbrooke Plaza, which makes me incredibly proud, and a Holbrooke Bridge, and then of course we went to Wright-Patterson, and there I relive, as I do each year, that dramatic first night of the peace talks when my husband seated me between Slobodan Milosevic and Alija Izbegovic, two mortal foes who just the week before had been literally gouging each other's eyes out, or trying to. And Richard said, "Okay, Kati, your job is to make them talk to each other." "Aye, aye, sir," said I. And really for most of that dinner, they were all pretending to ignore each other and looking off in the space in different directions. And at the point of despair at not being able to fulfill my first diplomatic mission, I said just into the air to neither one, I said, "How did this war start anyway?" Like some idiot child. And at that point, they each jumped in and started telling their version. And after a while, they forgot that I was sitting there, and Milosevic said to Izbegovic, "Alija, do you remember the first time we met? It was in Tito's office. You were sitting on a green couch." And Izbegovic said, "Yes, it was Muslim green." Yeah. And they were off. And I looked at the head table at my husband, and I went, and he went. And so like you, like Dayton, I too played my small part for history. And that was, as I said, the most rewarding chapter of my life. A few weeks after exhausting round-the-clock negotiations, because this was only the opening night, they signed the Dayton Accords, and the peace has held, how many years has it been? 23 years, not a shot fired in anger in Bosnia. Thank you, Dayton. but at what price? 100,000 people were killed on the road to Dayton, and thousands of others have become refugees. But here in Dayton, Richard said, and I quote, that the world's richest nation, one that presumes to great moral authority, cannot make worthy appeals to conscience and merely call on others to carry that burden. I wonder now, do we even call on others to carry a moral burden? I just want you to think about that. And I want to say a few strong words, if you'll allow me, about the present moment, because Richard is no longer able to do so. But I can assure you that he would be on fire at the way the United States is abandoning values. Values. This is not a political speech, I promise you, but those values are the ones that brought me and my family of refugees here. I came here not speaking a word of English, so I feel like I'm in very good company here because we all seem to be from someplace else, and this is what makes America still different from any other countries. I was a small child in the late 50s, and for the 2 years prior to that, I had been separated from my parents. Prior to our escape, my journalist mother and father were called enemies of the people by Hungarian authorities. Tender-aged children brutally separated from their parents, reporters who were called enemies of the people. Does that have a vaguely familiar ring? But that was the Cold War, and my homeland was Soviet-occupied Hungary. But in retaliation to my parents' jailing, the Eisenhower administration cut trade and cultural ties with Hungary for the simple reason that reporters are not enemies of the state, but as essential for a democracy to thrive as oxygen. So when our president declares that the gruesome assassination of a journalist is no reason for us to stop selling weapons to Jamal Khashoggi's alleged assassins, and we know that those alleged assassins are using those weapons in Yemen to the most barbaric effect. We saw the pictures on the front page of the New York Times today. Those are the weapons that we sell them. Well, I think it's time for the least politically engaged to speak up. And we're not discussing politics here, we're discussing values. America in 1995 stood for its original values here in Dayton. It was not our weapons of mass destruction that silenced the guns and stopped the genocide of Muslims in Bosnia. Of course, there was the implicit threat of force, which, by the way, in a typical Richard maneuver, was well represented on that first night that I told you about, because we were seated under giant bombers in the hangar at Wright-Patterson. And that was Richard's way of telling the Balkan chiefs that if diplomacy doesn't work, we have other tools to hand. But it was round-the-clock, painstaking, time-consuming diplomacy that resulted in the Dayton Accords. And that kind of diplomacy is as human an enterprise as the great writing which we celebrate tonight. Dayton shared in a moment when America walked the walk of the values which differentiate us from any other power on earth. We can no longer take those values for granted. Richard, whose diplomatic career began in Vietnam and ended in Afghanistan, knew something about the extremely short distance between hot words and pipe bombs. He had experienced that in war zones. Let's pay attention to the power of the words we speak. Words have power, and we're seeing them in recent days. I have to say, as the grandchild of grandparents who I never knew because they perished in Auschwitz, I never expected to see the terrible thing that unfolded in Pittsburgh yesterday in America. The most meaningful way to honor Richard's memory is for us, all of us, to be on fire now, upholding those endangered values. Thank you so much for everything you do to do that. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And finally, my revered friend, John Irving, congratulations on winning the Holbrooke Prize. And over to you, Bob.
Yeah, I think you can if you want. It's up to you. I might tinker with the mood a bit. But before I do, I'd like to add my own expression of gratitude, extreme gratitude, to this year's winners and runners-up, to Min and Michelle and Halala. Now I have to, because of Will's mnemonic on it, it's got to be Halala. And in spirit, I hope Ta-Nehisi Coates, just being a great writer is not quite enough to get you here. There's something different at play in Dayton. There has to be a sensibility there of the highest order, like a ghost or a spirit hovering inside your work and somewhere else inside of you that gives us a glimmer of our own better angels, our poor, battered, much abused, better angels. We're here because of this matrix of diplomacy and literature. They both save lives. Michelle and her work with Patrick is a perfect example of a book saving a life. They both open up doors to our hope for a world where we would just leave each other alone. At least let each other be. I don't quite understand that, and then of course I do, because it's about money and land, and hey, you looked at my wife wrong, and anything can happen. But whatever you feel about America today, and it's probably pretty gloomy, you have to believe in this part of it too, this Dayton part of it. You have to believe in tonight, because tonight celebrates a vision that will carry us through. That is Dayton. If you don't believe in this here, I don't think you believe in anything. So, John Irving, I've known him a long time. I'll tell you more about that. Let's see, right now, John Irving graduated from Georgetown Prep in 1983. I've got that wrong. That's Brett Kavanaugh's resume. You know, talk about Grant's memoirs. Grant's memoirs are considered the most a masterpiece of writing, but the greatest piece of deathbed writing ever. He had throat cancer when he wrote those memoirs, and he had a huge thing on his neck. He couldn't swallow food, and after finishing those memoirs, he went to bed and died. And this is pertinent because I think this is the way John Irving would like to have his Lifetime Achievement Award given to him. He writes his next book and dies, and then you can give him the award. He'd be much happier, because right now he's a bit cranky about it. He's still working very hard. He still will have another book out. He's still alive, and next May he's going to receive the National Arts Club Gold Medal in Literature. And people who get this award, John tells me, they die shortly after they receive it. Or they die at the ceremony itself. That makes John very envious, believe me. But I can tell you in all honesty that John is profoundly honored to receive this acknowledgement of his work here in Dayton, and he would be even more thrilled. In fact, he'd probably be euphoric if you could possibly hold the awards ceremony in Paris. All I can say is, John, Dayton's sorry that they couldn't wait for you to die to give you this wonderful award. And everybody here tonight is happy you're with us. Very happy, rather than with Philip Roth and Tom Wolfe and Ursula Le Guin and some others who, all whom died in 2018. This is the better place to be, John. Okay. This is not the first time I've been asked to introduce John Irving, and each time that I've been asked to do it, I think, really? Introduce John? Why? What's the point? Do you introduce Barack Obama or Donald Trump? No, some people, you present them. You don't need to introduce him. He's really too big to introduce. And what would be the point of introducing him? You just don't introduce people like John. You simply say, here he is, because everybody knows who they are, and I mean everybody. So I want to give you some evidence. In 2016, I was on a book tour in France, and every time I got off the train in whatever goddamn city I was, the first face I saw was John's. He was on a billboard in every train station, advertising Avenue of Mysteries. And that was sort of thrilling, but I mean, you'd think, okay, that's just France, no big deal. Misha? Okay, honey. Misha is my student. Misha, what's going on in India with the Irving thing?
Oh my God, like every time a book comes out, the railway stations and like everywhere there are billboards of him.
Yeah. Right. How many books does Irving sell in India?
Millions and millions and millions.
Yeah, I know, it's scary. Okay, hey, Sakina?
Here I am.
Hi, Sakina. When you went to get married in Costa Rica last year or the year before, were there billboards of John Irving on the highways and things?
Well, there were no billboards on the highways, but I can say during our ceremony, a little plane flew back and forth, towing a little banner that advertised John Irving's latest novel.
Yeah, right. How many books does Irving sell in Central and South America?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's too many to count. So, I mean, come on. You don't need to interview John Irving. Everybody in the world knows him. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about myself. No, I forgot. This word patriarchy, probably when John and I stand together and you see our white hair and our white skin, you think, there it is. the patriarchy. But Sakina and Misha, stand up again, because I want to talk about the new patriarchy. So these are some of the most talented women I have ever taught. They are amazing, and they will be stars one day. But so Kurt Vonnegut was John Irving's mentor. John Irving was my mentor. I was their mentor. Now they have literary DNA of John Irving and Kurt Vonnegut in them. That's who they are. To me, that's the new patriarchy. There's the girls. Thanks, ladies. Okay, about me then. In 1968, I was 17 years old. John Irving was 26. John Irving had just published his first novel called Setting Free the Bears. I walked into People's Drugstore in McLean, Virginia, where I grew up, and I went right to the paperback rack because I wanted to read something. And it was a vertical rack, and it twirled around, and I twirled it around, and it stopped at this book called Paperback Setting Free the Bears. I picked it up, I took it home, I read it, I was bewitched. I didn't bother to remember the author's name. I went away to college. There were 2 more books that sort of entranced me, and I looked at them, and it was by the guy who wrote Setting Free the Bears, 158-Pound Marriage, and The Water Method Man. Then I went into the Peace Corps, went away, came back, applied to all the MFA writing programs in America, and got rejected by all of them, Min and Michelle. And I went and got a master's degree in American literature at the University of Missouri in 1978, 77, 78, 79. A book came out that crushed me. It had everything to do with me becoming a writer, and it was called The World According to Garp. And it taught me about things about structure, about integrating ancient wisdom into a contemporary story. It taught me a lot about taking risks. It was just a mind blower, and it had the same effect on American culture. And I was just stunned by it. And I kept applying to writing schools, and I did get into Iowa. One of my teachers at Iowa happened to be a character in 158-Pound Marriage. He was John's best friend, a guy named Don Hendry Jr. And Don wasn't going to live too many more years, but before, I graduated from Iowa. I didn't know, but Hendry had told John, who I'd never met, never imagined meeting, had told John to take care of me. I didn't know that. And I was at Breadloaf as an unpublished book writer. I had no books. I was just there as a scholar in Breadloaf in 1983. And I was standing at the bank of mailboxes, and this guy came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Are you Coaches?" And I turned, and it's like, oh, God. Because John Irving was now a superstar in American culture. He had full-page ads of him in New Yorker magazine, dressed in your wrestling gear, and it was wild. And I couldn't believe it. And he said, "Henry, told me to look for you. Let's go out on the porch and talk." I was astounded. I had published a magazine story. I just couldn't believe what was happening to me. We sat down and talked, and we said blah, 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 and I said, I just saw Hendry in Tuscaloosa. He was running the writing program at University of Alabama, and there was a party, and I was at the party having a really nice conversation with this guy, and Hendry came up and pulled me away, and I said, "What's going on?" Hendry said, "That's a critic. Don't talk to him." And on the porch, Hendry said, "Yeah, that's right. Hendry's right. Don't talk to them." He get this very Trumpian voice. "They're your critics are your enemy." And before I could respond, John jumped up. There's a road that goes right through the center of Breadloaf. And a car was going through it. The speed limit was probably about 15 miles an hour, and a car was going through it at about 20 miles an hour. And John jumped up and ran and caught the car, like a dog catching the car, and demanded that they slow down. And this is a scene in Garp. All of a sudden, I don't know what reality is. Ever since meeting John Irving, I'm not sure what reality is. But that was just astonishing to me. So started the writing program at Bennington, which was near where John lived on the mountain up above Bennington and Dorset. And we'd have dinner twice a year forever. And I got to see your third child born and starting to grow up and everything, and be part of a family and call up on Super Bowl Sunday, who do you want to win? It was just so bewitching and generous, and that's the message I want to leave with you about who John Irving is. It's not just me. He did things for me and a whole range of young writers that I never knew about until somebody else told me about it. And from talking to other young writers, I know he had done the same for them. It didn't matter who. He was there. It was like really having a big brother in a place where you never really expected to have anybody really truly helping you out, because that's what they really believed in. They help you out because maybe they could make some money or something. That's what other people were doing. But when John helped you out, it was like the best gift. It was a miracle. So John, it's the 40th anniversary of The World According to Garp. And John emailed me the other day. He said, that 40-year-old novel begins with a sexual assault in a movie theater where, guess what, no one believes the woman who was assaulted. That sounds a little too fucking familiar to be believed. And this fall marks the 40th anniversary of Garp, which I imagined when I was writing it would be out of date before I could finish the manuscript. Who knew that sexual hatred wasn't going away? Who knew that sexual intolerance would still be tolerated? But it is. So, John, inspired by those magnificent lions that guard the entrance to the New York Public Library in Manhattan, the accolade literary lion would, by the middle of the 20th century, be bestowed upon America's greatest living writers, and by the end of that century and the beginning of this one, perhaps no member of that distinguished pride roared as mightily across the planet as the voice of novelist John Irving, the indefatigable author of 14 novels, soon to be 15, and I bet he'll even get to 16. And 10 of those have been international bestsellers. He has sold millions of copies in America. He's sold more books overseas, which to me is incredible. Just to be around somebody like, whoa, you the man. The 76-year-old Irving has been widely celebrated both here and abroad as a master storyteller and comic genius, anchored deep within layer upon layer of gravitas, praised equally for his intrepid and fearless engagement with controversial subject matter and for the depth of his empathetic humanity, both as an artist and as a person. Irving's narcotically addictive fictions have made him a household name in dozens of nations. And it's earned him the rare status of an acclaimed literary writer who has simultaneously achieved stratospheric popular commercial success. And it can be said with some certainty that John Irving is the only literary lion in history to be both inducted into the Wrestling Hall of Fame. And by the way, he was wrestling today after that panel with Mark Harmon. And they said, come on, Mark, beat his ass, he's an old man. But I think John got the better of him. Both the Wrestling Hall of Fame and presented with an Oscar. This is the wrap-up, John. If I can get the page. John Irving wants to be known as a world-class entertainer, and he is. And he also wouldn't mind if we think of him as our time's, or our generation's version of Charles Dickens, and we do. But what makes Irving such a beloved author around the world is that against the violence he finds sweeping down on us, he provides the counterweight of a gentle affection between people, and let's not forget, animals. Merciful and sincere and indeed heartbreaking in its frequent futility. And against desperation, we find in Irving, always when we least expect it, a hand extended against bigotry and hatred. When all the accounting is done, he'll be remembered as one of the most generous writers representing us in the world and in the future. I know over these decades, John's pissed off a few people. Too bad. I know that not everybody loves John or loves his work, but I also know that millions and millions of people do. That's astonishing. That's as big of a mystery to me as how do you get planes to fly? There's something there that is stratospheric and transcendent, and I'm in awe, and I always will be in love with John Irving.
Never write Bob an email when you're working on a speech. He'll steal half of it. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kati. And thank you, Richard Holbrooke. I'm grateful when anyone notices that my fiction has a social conscience. I'm more used to hearing that I repeat myself. It's no coincidence that sexual intolerance and sexual violence repeat themselves too. I'm speaking to you as an American who lives in Canada. More than 3 years ago, I went through the immigration process in Toronto. In various waiting rooms, I was occasionally the only adult applicant for permanent residence who spoke English. I helped the other applicants fill out their immigration forms. A few times, I saw those families who were granted protected person status by the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. I worked with the children. They understood English better than their parents. I remember a girl, she was 12 or 13. She was actually worried about my immigration story. "What about you, mister?" she asked me. "What are you running away from?" Last month, as the number of refugees from war and other human rights violations continued to rise, the Trump administration capped refugee admissions at the lowest level since 1980. I'm remembering that girl and her family who were running for their lives. All I did was marry my Canadian editor of the Cider House Rules. She later became my literary agent. We were living in the US and in Canada, but we got tired of going back and forth. Now we live in Toronto full-time. We were never running for our lives. Yet this young girl, who had endured a dangerous and fearful life, was worried about me. I got my sexual politics and my social conscience from my mother. She taught me to see and sympathize with sexual minorities, beginning with the understanding that women were treated as if they were sexual minorities. From their example, I could see that more vulnerable groups, gay men, lesbian women, transgender men and women, were treated worse. The World According to Garp is a sexual assassination story. Garp's mother is killed by a man who hates women. Her son is killed by a woman who hates men. When I was beginning Garp in the early 70s, I thought that sexual violence, what I was writing about, would soon be extinct. In 1978, when Garp was published, I thought I'd written a period piece. I was wrong. As I wrote to Bob, sexual hatred hasn't gone away. We should be ashamed that sexual intolerance is still tolerated, but it is. The World According to Garp is a feminist novel. Yet, in the passage of time, I've become more of a feminist. Why? Because the discrimination women faced in the startup days of the women's movement hasn't gone away. The anti-abortion crusaders are still here. Women are still treated as if they were sexual minorities. Even today, 60% of women who've been sexually assaulted never report their abuse. You can understand why they don't. We've seen repeatedly and just recently how women who are brave enough to come forward are not believed. They are even ridiculed by the President of the United States. It's no coincidence that the World According to Garp begins with a sexual assault. Garp's mother is assaulted in a movie theater. As I wrote to Bob, no one believes she was assaulted, not even her own family. Roberta, the transgender woman who used to be a tight end for the Philadelphia Eagles, is a hero in Garp, and for 40 years, a personal hero of mine. I'm still writing about Roberta. Miss Frost, the transgender librarian in One Person, came from Roberta. Flor, the transgender prostitute in Avenue of Mysteries, came from Roberta and Miss Frost. President Obama recognized transgender rights. In May 2016, the Department of Education instructed schools to accept students' gender identity, which was not defined by the sex listed on their birth certificates or by their genitalia. This allowed students to use the bathrooms of their choice. President Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, revoked these compassionate guidelines soon after she was confirmed. In October of last year, President Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, ruled that transgender people were not protected from workplace discrimination. President Trump and the Department of Justice are opposed to transgender rights. I know what Roberta would say. Just last week, the New York Times reported that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is attempting to establish a legal definition of sex. How convenient. They want to define gender as an immutable condition determined at birth, thus rolling back the clock on the recognition and protection of transgender men and women. The Trump administration is considering no less than defining transgender out of existence. If this happens in the US, I know what will happen in Canada. American transgender men and women will seek protected person status as human rights refugees, like the families whose immigration forms I helped to fill out. But those refugees were from places like Syria and Afghanistan, you know, places that have long been accused of human rights abuses. These are sexually abusive times in the United States. The world, according to Garp, should be out of date. Garp was written in a divided time, but this country is more divided today than it was 40 years ago. The World According to Garp is a protest novel. I would write a few more. The Cider House Rules was published in 1985, more than a decade after the Roe v. Wade the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that gave women the right to an abortion. Cider House is an historical novel, but it's also an abortion novel. The Roe v. Wade decision isn't safe. Does the U.S. Supreme Court look safe to you? The best first sentence to a novel I've written is the first sentence in Last Night and in Twisted River. The young Canadian, who could not have been more than 15, had hesitated too long. My longest first sentence is in A Prayer for Owen Meany. I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice, not because of his voice or because he was the smallest person I ever knew, or even because he was the instrument of my mother's death, but because he is the reason I believe in God. That's not all the first sentence, but that's enough. I'll stop there. I don't believe in God. In part, I wrote the novel to create the kind of miracle that would make a believer out of me, if I'd ever known anyone like Owen Meany. I didn't. More accurately, I thought I didn't. One Christmas in the early 1980s, I went home to New Hampshire. I spent the better part of one night with some childhood friends. I hadn't seen them in years. We spent our time remembering friends who were killed in Vietnam or who returned from the war so badly damaged that they would never recover from it. In addition to these casualties, we included those friends whose lives were forever changed, in some cases ruined, because of the extreme measures they took not to go to Vietnam. Suddenly, one of my friends mentioned a name that drew a blank with me. Either I never knew him or I didn't remember him. Then another of my friends reminded me that in Sunday school, we used to lift up this little boy. He was our age, about 8 or 9, but he was so tiny we could pass him back and forth over our heads. It enraged him, which was why we did it. It might even have been my idea. At least it was the opinion of my friends that I was the first one who picked him up. I remembered him instantly. He and his family moved away long before we were teenagers. I had no further contact with him, but someone heard he'd been killed in Vietnam. I was amazed. I said one of the stupidest things I've ever said. But he was too small to go to Vietnam. My friends looked at me with pity and concern. "Johnny," one of them said, "maybe he grew." That night I lay awake in bed wondering, what if he didn't grow? That was when I knew Owen Meany was a Vietnam novel, another protest novel. The politics in my novels aren't always sexual, but my interest in being political began with sexual politics. I keep saying this. I've been saying this for too long. Of my 14 novels, by my count, 6 or 7 are what I would call political, or they have what my mom called a social conscience. The 15th, the one I'm writing now, is another one. It suffices to say that half my novels are protesting something. Don't get me wrong. As I said earlier today, I don't think protest is a requirement for a novel. I'm just comfortable with protesting when I see a place for it. When I was writing Garp and Cider House and Owen Meany and 4 or 5 other novels, I could see the appropriate places. I just never imagined there would be so many places. Thank you.